Ladies and gentlemen, tonight as you prepare to drift into the quiet corners of your mind and search for that elusive comfort of sleep, I invite you to travel with me back across the millennia, into the sands of time, into the slow, echoing chambers of ancient Egyptian history, where the queens once lived, once ruled, once plotted, once suffered, and where their lives, in all their disturbing grandeur, continue to whisper faintly across the dusty stone of temples and tombs. The subject, though fascinating to some, is for our purpose tonight deliberately unhurried, deliberately steady, and perhaps deliberately soporific. I want to tell you about the disturbing life of ancient Egyptian queens in such a way that the monotony of detail, the repetition of centuries, and the long shadows of forgotten dynasties will ease you into a gentle state of rest. When we think of Egypt, the image that arises is almost always pyramids, sand, and the flowing Nile. But behind those pyramids stood kings, and beside those kings stood queens, some celebrated, some forgotten, many confined to the margins of hieroglyphic records, and others elevated to divine status. Their stories are lined with both splendor and cruelty, comfort and fear, and in their lives we see the entanglement of politics, religion, and survival. The queens of ancient Egypt were not merely passive companions to their pharaoh husbands, nor were they entirely autonomous rulers in every case. Rather, they existed in a space that was constantly shifting, sometimes honored, sometimes manipulated, sometimes erased, and at times worshipped as goddesses. The earliest queens we know by name date back to the very first dynasties. For example, Merneith of the first dynasty is remembered on a few stone stelae and a tomb at Abydos. Was she truly a ruler or merely the regent for her son? Historians debate. But to imagine her life is to imagine a woman caught between tradition and innovation, standing at the cusp of dynastic power. To rise as a woman in the patriarchal structures of the early dynasties required both shrewd alliances and ritual endorsement, and yet, little is recorded of her voice. All we are left with are symbols, inscriptions, tomb placements, and the endless silence of stone, a silence that now repeats itself in your mind like a soft lullaby of monotony. As dynasties grew and centuries slipped by, queens were increasingly tied to the religious identity of the pharaohs. They bore titles like, Great Royal Wife, She Who Sees Horus and Seth, and, Mistress of the Two Lands. These titles, ceremonial as they sound, carried immense expectations. A queen was not only the partner of a king but also a symbolic mother to the gods, an earthly embodiment of divine femininity. Her body was a political tool, her womb a sacred space, her presence in festivals a ritual necessity. Yet in the glittering halls of palaces, behind the curtains of ritual, queens also endured suspicion, rivalry, jealousy, and schemes that often threatened their safety. Take, for instance, Queen Hatshepsut, mother of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. Her tomb, discovered in pieces, tells a quiet story of disturbance. Buried once, then mysteriously reburied, with her coffin empty yet her treasures intact, her resting place became a puzzle for archaeologists. Why was her body missing? Was it a robbery, a reburial, a ritual removal, or an act of political concealment? We do not know. But what we do know is that the queen's afterlives were as uncertain as their earthly lives. Imagine her wandering spirit, dislocated from her corpse, unable to unite fully with eternity, bound instead to the endless sleep of questions without answers. And it is in such repetition of questions that one begins to feel the heaviness of time. In the Middle Kingdom, queens seemed to fade somewhat from prominence. Their lives were tied more tightly to the private sphere, though their tombs and jewelry still spoke of status. In this period, the role of the king was elevated as the singular figure of divine authority, leaving queens in the periphery. Yet still, the disturbing undertones remained. Queens might be adored for their beauty and honored in death, yet they were often pawns in larger struggles. Their children were heirs, and heirs were constantly in danger. For a queen, her survival and her legacy depended not just on her loyalty to the king but on the uncertain fate of her sons, the fragile thread upon which dynastic continuity hung. It is in the New Kingdom, however, that the lives of Egyptian queens become most dramatic, and most unsettling. The best known, perhaps, is Queen Hatshepsut. She was not content with the titles of wife, mother, or regent. She took the unprecedented step of becoming king herself, ruling not as a queen but as pharaoh. She dressed in male regalia, donned the false beard of kingship, and commissioned inscriptions calling herself the son of Amun. But what disturbances marked her reign? To rule as a female king was both groundbreaking and dangerous. She constructed magnificent temples, brought wealth through trade, and maintained peace, but her legacy was nearly erased by her successor Thutmose III, who systematically destroyed her images. Why? Perhaps revenge, perhaps tradition, perhaps an attempt to restore male continuity. The disturbing thought here is how fragile memory is, how easily a life of power and glory could be scratched away from the walls of stone, leaving behind only broken fragments for archaeologists to piece together thousands of years later. Another queen of disturbing fame is Nefertiti, whose beauty has been immortalized in a bust that now sits in Berlin. She was the wife of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who abandoned the traditional gods to worship Aten, the sun disk. Nefertiti herself was portrayed as almost equal to the king, smiting enemies, wearing crowns, leading ceremonies. But as the Amarna experiment collapsed, so too did the clarity of her story. Did she die early, or did she become a co-ruler under another name? Was she erased intentionally? Did she survive into the reign of Tutankhamun? We are left with disturbing gaps, with hints of her power and hints of her disappearance, echoing like faint murmurs across the centuries. And then there is Nefertari, beloved wife of Ramses II. Unlike many queens, she is remembered through her stunning tomb in the Valley of the Queens, its walls painted with vibrant colors that still shimmer today. Ramses called her, the one for whom the sun shines. Yet behind this poetry, we know little of her inner life. Her role as a queen may have brought her luxury, but her life was still circumscribed by the dangers of childbirth, court politics, and the constant presence of foreign threats. Even in her magnificent tomb, there is a disturbing undertone. Why was she so lavishly honored while other queens faded into anonymity? What distinguished her, and what price did she pay? The lives of later queens, particularly in the Ptolemaic period, grow even more disturbing, as Greek rulers fused with Egyptian traditions, producing queens who were not only consorts but active rulers, embroiled in intrigue and bloodshed. None is more famous than Cleopatra VII, whose life has been told and retold through drama, poetry, and film. But beyond the glamour, her life was a tapestry of disturbance, alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, wars against her own siblings, the looming power of Rome pressing against her kingdom, and ultimately, her tragic death, whether by snakebite or poison, remains debated. Her life was marked by brilliance and survival, but also by an atmosphere of constant manipulation and threat. To be queen in this era was to balance beauty, intellect, and ruthless politics, all under the shadow of inevitable loss. When we gather all these stories, from Merneith to Cleopatra, we see that the disturbing lives of ancient Egyptian queens were filled with contradictions. They were exalted yet endangered, powerful yet vulnerable, divine yet human. They lived in palaces adorned with gold, but those walls often echoed with whispers of betrayal, rivalry, and plots. Their tombs glittered with treasures, but their bodies were sometimes stolen, lost, or desecrated. Their names were carved in stone, yet just as often chiseled out, leaving only broken traces. Their beauty was praised, yet their individuality was erased. Theirs was not a life of peace but a constant negotiation with survival. And as you listen to this long, slow recounting, you might notice how the pattern of their lives repeats. Birth, marriage, ceremony, rivalry, children, danger, death, remembrance, erasure. Over and over, dynasty after dynasty, queen after queen. The monotony of history becomes a kind of rhythm, like the lapping of the Nile's waters, or the endless shifting of desert sands, steady, predictable, and hypnotic. And within that rhythm, the disturbing details, disappearances, rivalries, mysterious tombs, become softened, worn down by time, until they are but faint impressions. You may feel your mind drifting now, lulled by the weight of centuries pressing into one another, one queen's life dissolving into another's, one dynasty blending into the next, all bound together in the long twilight of ancient Egypt. And so, as we bring this speech to its close, let us remember that the disturbing lives of Egyptian queens are not merely relics of the past but lessons in the fragility of power, the impermanence of memory, and the unending march of time. Their stories remind us that glory and suffering are intertwined, that beauty and danger walk hand in hand, and that even the most exalted among us may be forgotten, erased, or misunderstood. But in the slow, heavy telling of their lives, in the deliberate monotony of their history, we find a strange comfort, a quiet that invites rest. So let the queens of Egypt, with all their disturbed and disturbing fates, now fade into silence, and may that silence lead you gently, inevitably, into the stillness of sleep.